I am honored to be here today and excited to talk about functional behavior assessments. It seems like a good start would be to discuss what a functional behavior assessment is. You can see here that definition pulled from the U.S. Department of Education. Really, this is kind of the technical, definition, and we're going to talk a little bit about function. If you want to think about function as like the motivation or the reason why the behavior is occurring, that might be helpful. But as you can see there, you can read that definition, but it may be also easier to think of it in these words instead, maybe a little bit more user-friendly, is really we're looking at what is the why behind the behavior, or why is it occurring? And the reason we need to know that is we have to know kind of the source of the problem and what's going on in order to plan around it. So really that FBA is the process for helping the team figure out why that behavior is happening to create a plan to reduce the behaviors. I might use a medical analogy throughout this presentation to kind of help. So this one's pretty straightforward, right? You go to the doctor and the doctor needs to examine you and assess you first before they figure out what they're going to do to treat whatever's going on with you. So when is an FBA needed? Unfortunately, we don't have super clear guidance, federal guidance with when it's needed. And when I say needed, there's no clear federal guidance on when it's like absolutely required. There's some language around you should or teams should consider, using an FBA when, behaviors are interfering with the student's ability to access education. I'd also add if the child's behavior is affecting their peers' ability to access instruction as well. That's really when we kind of think it's a problem at that point and we need to do something to address it. But really, the guidance that we would want to give you and leave you with today in the conversations you're having is that it's really best practice whenever the students, having difficulty accessing learning or making it difficult for others to learn. The most important thing to remember is that the FBA process doesn't have to be this big, long, convoluted process. Sometimes it is. And as you can see down there, we really recommend that, if we have a big, intense behavior that's been happening for a long time, there's safety concerns, the team has a lot of questions, we might need to dive in deep for a while to really get some good information. However, if we have a behavior, maybe it's just started, it's not super intense, there are safety concerns, that FBA process could be, pretty minimal and doesn't have to be super time intensive. And really, it'd be best practice to do some sort of investigating before we move forward with a plan when we're at the point of really needing to dive in to understand what's going on a little bit better. So when we do that assessment, there's some kind of key areas that would want to make sure that we consider and we're familiar with as we work through those assessment details. Also, I should have noted too, if you happen to have a student or a child in mind as we're working through this, it may be helpful. And then even more so, if you happen to have a copy of the FBA form or your child's FBA, it may be helpful to grab that and work through that as we're going through these slides together. And if you do happen to have one of those forms, one of the first things you'll see on there is that it asks about the strengths and skills of the child. This, to me, is an underutilized area within the FBA process, and we can sometimes be focused too much on what the child is doing that's interfering with accessing education, as opposed to thinking about how we can build on all the awesome things that this child has to offer. And really, we want to be thinking about strengths and skills that could be related to the learning environment that would help the team plan around how to best support the student. So our students could have all sorts of strengths and skills that may not be applicable to the school environment. Almost all of them are, though, if you think about it. But we really want to be thinking about what are those ones we want to highlight. So some examples here. And I should note, too, as we go through these upcoming slides, you'll see on the left side is kind of that box with the overall description of what this portion of the form or the assessment looks like. And then on the right side, we'll have some examples that are mostly made up, but some of these are actually pulled from some students' IEPs with non-identifying information. So one example of what this might look like is that the student is good at building with blocks or using blocks and prefers math compared to other subjects. It's pretty easy to see how we might be able to incorporate some of those interests, or I should say strengths and skills, into the student's day. That second one there, again, I'm talking about the student's ability to use that alternative augmentative communication device, and the team would want to think about how they might be able to build off of that skill. So closely related but slightly different are preferences and interests. So this is really thinking about how we could use those interests and preferences into the student's plans. So again, our students might have all sorts of preferences and interests. We really want to be targeting those ones that are most applicable and helpful in the school environment to think through how we might incorporate those. So for example, here we have a student that has an interest in superheroes and a preference for hands-on learning. So knowing that those interests and preference, we can think about maybe a visual token board, because that involves some manipulatives and thinking about maybe that academic tasks being more hands-on, and then maybe we could have a theme with that visual schedule and token board that the student is really interested in that we could think about incorporating across their day. The next section in the FBA is the appropriate behavior section. I would say historically, in my opinion, this has been a section that's been utilized and even just discussed in terms of the way that we can use this with our students. So really, the FBA, a lot of the focus is going to be on those behaviors of concern that interfere with the child's ability to access. But we know that most of our students are engaged in appropriate behavior for a majority of their day. It can be easy to focus on some of those target behaviors and those behaviors of concerns because the emotions involved in the disruption to the classroom. But we can't lose sight of all the awesome things that our students are doing and how we might be able to build off of those. So really, we're thinking about what are the conditions, or when is the student more likely to engage in these appropriate behaviors. So some of these examples here, and again, there's so many different ways you could look at it. These are more centered around those functions that I mentioned before. And again, we don't need to talk about those a ton for our purposes, but we can think about how these might be incorporated in the student's plan. So they have a choice of what task or demand to complete. They're more likely to have appropriate behavior. So we can think about using that across their day and maybe doing that preventatively to increase more appropriate behavior. Or when they're working towards something highly motivating, like all of us, we tend to maybe work a little bit better, a little more efficiently when we have something highly motivating in the front of our mind. And then that idea of maybe that checking in, providing high rates of non-contingent attention, or we're just providing attention for free, is something that the team noticed increases the likelihood for appropriate behaviors. So why don't we do that preventatively on the front end to decrease the likelihood of problem behaviors as well? All right, the majority of the FBA does focus on these target behaviors. I've started calling them target behaviors or behaviors of concern. You may still see some language out there called problem behaviors. I've tried to move away from that just based on some feedback and maybe my own feelings around when we describe them as problem behaviors. It sometimes can inadvertently suggest that the child's a problem, even though we are obviously not meeting that. But again, I think words matter, right? And the way we talk about behaviors carries weight. So you'll probably hear me refer to them as behaviors of concern quite a bit, which I prefer. And these are really those categories of behavior that we need to define specific to that student. So I picked out an example purposely that I've had some feedback on in the past that I want to talk about a little bit. So this example here would be aggression. We might call it physical aggression, differentiate that from verbal aggression. Some teams define both of those. So we're going to have our general category of the student engages in behaviors that result in forceful contact with another individual. That definition could be consistent across all different individuals you're working with. However, the examples and non-examples should be specific to that student. So now we're really thinking about identifying what is the actual behavior for the student that we're looking to track. And the reason it's so important to define these is because we need to make sure we have a clear way to measure what that the concern is, right? What the team has decided that that issue is we're going to address. And without clearly defining that, it's going to be hard to address it. It also sets a stage for us to progress monitor progress. If we don't have a clear definition and we come up with a plan, we're not going to really know based on our data collection whether or not that student's making progress or not. So I want to circle back to something I mentioned when I first brought up this example, is that we've got some feedback in the past that aggression is assumes that the student is choosing to misbehave. I may not be paraphrasing that exactly right, but a parent had kind of brought that to our attention where we really need to be thinking about aggression as a form of communication. And I wholeheartedly agree, and you'll never hear anyone from our team say otherwise. We believe that behavior is a form of communication. And really, for our purposes, it doesn't really matter what we call the behavior as much as we just have a clear way to describe it and measure it across staff. So when I say that, when I bring up that example of this one, we decided as a team, we're just going to call it behavior A. That kind of pulls out that negative connotation. We can define it the same way, and it kind of moves away from that idea of aggression if that's something that the team didn't feel good about calling it. All right, we're diving into ways to measure behavior. So here we're looking at the dimensions of behavior, kind of how we might be able to start collecting data around it. I'm going to focus on this left side first, that frequency and duration. There are other dimensions of behavior that aren't listed here. However, frequency and duration are our two main ones that we focus on. Specifically with frequency, we're going to count the number of times the behavior occurs in a day. And apologies, I should say behavior instead of aggression. So maybe we count, the example would be to count the number of times aggression occurs across the day. Just a straight up count, a tally. And we might turn that into a rate per hour depending on the team's preference. So that's one of our most common for sure. And then duration is also a common way that we track behavior. So we're really just looking at the length of time that it occurs from the start and end of it. How long might that last? We're typically looking at behaviors that have more of a longer duration, something like elopement or refusal are typically ones that we target with duration. Where frequency, we're looking at more of those discrete ones like aggression, maybe disruption or yelling. They may not occur for long periods of time, but when they do, they're short but still concerning. The other side here of our slide, we have conditions. So now we're just talking about when and where the data was collected. So we're looking at what might be going on in the environment around that. So we might be collecting data when they're working with adults, or maybe we're looking at times of the day or during transition times. So really what's going on in the environment during these times. And then location, this one's somewhat similar, but this one's really specific to where the behavior took place. So now we're really looking at maybe in math class, something like that, as a way to track this. So our conditions and location, they're going to tell us more about when and where to plan around. And then our frequency and duration are going to give us a better idea for kind of how big of an issue is this. All right, diving into data collection, we love to use acronyms in education, as many of you know, and here is another one. This one is actually a word, though, so it makes it a little bit easier to remember. So RIOT, R-I-O-T, is a common acronym for all sources of data that we consider when we're doing the assessment process. So this acronym isn't necessarily specific to behavior. However, it applies to behavior in the FBA, the social emotional behavioral domain, as we complete our FBA. So if we look at review, that R there, we're really looking at a record review, looking at previous IEPs, outside agency reports, cumulative files, and just kind of getting an idea of what's already been occurred in the past and what information can we glean from that. An interview, this one's pretty straightforward. This oftentimes would be a standardized list of questions that we would connect with as many of the team members as possible, depending on that level of concern. Again, go back to that conversation before about matching the level of rigor of your assessment to the rigor of the problem. We might interview all the teachers if we've got a pretty big issue, or we just, interview that one that we're seeing the most problems with. One of the things that we do want to stress, in particular for this group, and something that we're working on very hard at in Iowa City is to look at how we can incorporate student voice more often in this assessment process. And this is a great place to get student voice and interview a student to kind of get an idea of what motivates them, what are they seeing, what are their goals, and how we might be able to build off of that. This third one here, the O, observe, this is a little bit more rigorous because although interviews are super helpful, we unfortunately aren't always the best at remembering everything and reporting as well as we'd like to. Where observation, we get to see what happens in the natural setting and really look for those patterns around the antecedents, what's happening before the behavior, and then those consequences or the responses after the behavior, and really get a good idea of what this looks like in the natural setting. This is typically done by people who have some more advanced training. Oftentimes our AEA folks are helping out with this, or school psychologists or school social workers. We also have some members on our team that do some of this work as well within Iowa City. This last one, test, is one that you probably need to know the least about because it's the least common. It's also the most advanced. So really, we're looking at setting up situations and manipulating the environment to try to determine what's going on with that behavior. So this has been likened to an allergy test. Again, a medical analogy here. You go to get a test for allergies, and they give you small doses of those allergens to see those potential allergens to see how you react. This is kind of similar as we might manipulate the environment to see, hey, what happens if we provide tension every 5 minutes? How does that affect the behavior? Or what happens if we present a demand in this way? How does that affect the behavior? And looking for patterns and really doing some more scientific methods type of testing and data collection. Once we've done all that data collection, we'll come up with a summary. We want to look at our new and existing data. So again, we looked at those records. We were talking to all the people that we could, doing those interviews, observing, doing the tests, and then we synthesize all of that. Two of the main areas that you're going to see that get synthesized as part of this data collection is antecedents and consequences. So starting with antecedents, we're really looking at what happens prior to the target behavior. So in this example here, we have prior to the instance of refusal, the most common antecedents included presenting demands. So 100% of times, demands were presented prior to refusal behavior occurring. That's a pretty good indication you've got some patterns around why this behavior is occurring and what's happening prior to it that can help us identify that function. And then that'll lead to some behavior intervention planning. Consequences is the next section. This is somewhat confusing in our everyday language because consequences has that negative meaning or connotation, where in our ABC or in our SEBH world, we really are not meaning this in a negative way. So a synonym, or if it's helpful to think of consequences as responses, is the best way to maybe help you avoid that pitfall of thinking of it negatively. So in this instance, in our example, the team wrote up the responses or those consequences. And I think the piece that's most important to me is that third bullet there. They found that it was effective in stopping the behavior. Even though it didn't occur a lot, it was effective in stopping the behavior each time, which is an indicator that that may be reinforcing. Again, you don't need to know all of this stuff for the ABC data analysis because we've got people in the building that know how to do this. But I think it's interesting to look for some of these patterns and understand why the team might then hypothesize certain functions depending on those patterns in the behavior. Or excuse me, the patterns in the data with the behavior. All right, we're nearing the end here. This is kind of getting where it's the catch-all portion of the FBA. So really, we're looking at anything else that might help us in creating a behavior intervention plan. And these are things I typically think they're not as related to the function as much, and it's more related to the immediate what's happening immediately, or excuse me, it's less relevant to what's happening immediately in the environment, and there are more of these overarching conditions or things going on. So setting events, those are all sorts of different things. Maybe the child just started medication, maybe they're sick, maybe they have a parent who's traveling out of the country for a long period of time, right? There's just a ton of different setting events that might affect our behaviors. Really, we're going to be looking for ones that are pretty significant. So you can see here in the example that they had a surgery affecting their hearing. We could see how that could be affecting their behavior and how they may need to dive in a little bit more to get some additional support for the team to consider. All right, so once we've done all of that information gathering, we're at the point where we can develop a hypothesis statement. So these should include that context, when and where the behavior occurs, the antecedent, the behavior of concern, and then the hypothesized function. A good hypothesis statement should include all of those. So you can see here that for the student, they're saying during independent work time or whole group instruction, that's the context, that's when or where it occurs. When demands are presented, that's the antecedent. The student engages in refusal or noncompliance, that's the behavior of concern, in order to escape demands, and that's a hypothesized function. One thing that I'll stop and pause here for a second to note too is that I think the way that we talk about function can sometimes also be off-putting might be too strong of a word, but you'll see where I'm going with that with parents as we're having these conversations, because I have had people say or question this to be like, well, this statement sounds like the kid's manipulative, like they're doing things to take advantage of people. And that's not at all what we mean by these statements. And so sometimes I think it might be helpful to rephrase these, and even something as small as to say, when demands are presented, the student engages in noncompliance, which results in escaping demands, is another way to phrase it. Because really, we're saying that that's what happens in the environment. That's what adults are doing, right? Really, the A's and the C's, that's adult behavior. And that's honestly what we're really looking to target with these hypothesis statements, and figuring out what's going on in the environment that is not supporting the student, that we as adults can affect to help that student be more successful. So hopefully that's maybe a different way to kind of conceptualize these hypothesis statements and function, and is helpful if you do hear school teams talking about it in that way to help reframe that conversation. So some possible next steps. So once we do an FBA, if we're talking about a student who's entitled and has a behavior intervention plan, or at least a behavior intervention plan, there's some, next steps for that. We may do an FBA though as well, or have a lower level FBA for maybe a student that's not entitled that results with accommodations and supports, and or a combination of both of these, depending on it. So really the most important thing to know is that our FBA should lead to some next steps that help the team determine what are the supports and what do we need to do as a team, what plan do we need to implement to help that student.